Ladies and gentlemen, my name is not Helga Kalm. I'm standing in for her. She's been called to the hospital, so you will have to deal with me. On the panel, we also have Gert-Jan Koopman, Director General at DG Enlargement and Eastern Neighbourhood, ENEST of the European Commission. Mr. Koopman, thank you very much for joining. We know that you are under time pressure. My question to you is fairly simple and follows on from what we've just heard and what comes out of the American pronouncements over the last days, and that is whether enlargement is really the policy framework through which the European Union can best secure its geostrategic interests. Of course, it does not do that in isolation. I know that full well, but can it accelerate, as the Commission President has asked, the process of Ukraine and other candidate countries, whilst not being able to provide the security guarantees that are needed to live up to the expectations that have been raised?
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Apologies for not being able to be with you today, and apologies also for having to run, given the situation which your Foreign Affairs Minister just described in quite a bit of detail. To answer your question, I think that we are now at a juncture where Europe will have to step up, and enlargement is a critical element of the response. It's pretty binary. Unless we double down and use the tools that potentially we have already had at our disposal for quite a while, we are going to have very serious difficulties on the continent. Of course, this has to be complemented with security investments. We will need to have a very deep discussion about security guarantees, and I personally think that that will have to be part of the mix. But accession is important also for security, because it is one layer of de-risking the situation in the candidate countries on our borders. Now, at the same time, as some of the previous speakers have said, we will need to ensure that accession is earned on merit and that the countries are also ready. And whilst this may seemingly look like a paradox, the process of gradual integration actually provides a very good answer to it. And the good news is that we have already started investing in it through the growth plans in the Western Balkans, the Ukraine plan in Ukraine, the DCFTAs in Ukraine and Moldova and Georgia, and the Moldova growth plan, which we hope to finalize in negotiations between Council and Parliament tonight, and which we want to roll out next month. I think what is clear is that the pace at which we have been moving is too slow for the realities that we are confronted with today, but nothing stops us, together with our partners, from accelerating this gradual integration. Let me give you one very concrete example. In Moldova, where Russia is instrumentalizing energy supplies once again to destabilize the country, to force the elections in a direction that is Russian-friendly, anti-Western, we have been able to work very rapidly with the Moldovan authorities to agree on an emergency response and a package at the heart of which is an energy independence and resilience plan that would fully integrate and make Moldova's energy system independent from Russian fossil fuel by the end of next year. In the meantime, because this is not cost-free, we will carry a significant portion of the costs. And we also emphatically extended this to the region of Transnistria. Why am I mentioning this? Because this is gradual integration. In fact, it's not so gradual, it's pretty fast partial integration, accelerated integration, if you will, in one area, coming with regulatory alignment, investments in infrastructure, and with support for the transition that is not just important from an economic point of view, but is actually crucial from a security point of view. We should look at our policies and our toolkit from this perspective and make similar offers to our partners in the candidate countries. In fact, that is what we are reflecting on. This is one of the reasons that I will have to leave you soon. But we need to realize that the EU is the world's biggest internal market, that the size of our economy is not particularly small. Russia represents less than 20% of the size of the European economy, and that we have the capacity and the agency to address some of these problems, provided we put the resolve into it. And this is why I believe that the enlargement policy, broadly defined, with a particular emphasis on gradual integration, which we will accelerate, is a critical element of the response to the present situation. It's not the full solution. I come back to what I said at the start. For that, we also need a security piece, but it can really help very significantly. And that is the contribution which my department, under the leadership of Commissioner Kos, is intending to bring. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Koopman. We know I have to leave, so we won't keep you much longer. You have important business to attend to. Thank you so much for joining. And he's gone. But that leaves us a bit more time for a panel debate with Deputy Minister Migi Fino, Deputy Minister of European Affairs of Albania, Rodica Krudu, State Secretary of European Affairs of Moldova, and, as already mentioned, Jonathan Sovyov, Secretary General of the MFA here in Estonia. Deputy Minister Fino, I would like to start with you. The US has drawn down its USAID program in Albania. Over the last couple of years, the US Embassy has worked very closely with the EU delegation in Tirana in support of a common value base to advance constitutional reform, justice sector reform, public administration reform, very structural reforms in Albania, and seems all of a sudden, poof, gone. Am I mischaracterizing this? What is your expectation of the European Union if indeed it turns out that the US is no longer supporting the integration process of Albania?
Well, thank you very much to the organizers for hosting us. And actually, it's an honor to be in this room full of experts on the field, but also I think it's very important that we have this here in Tallinn, which is quite distant geographically from Albania. So I think it makes it even the most important to have this exchange between us and for you to get to know Albania a bit more and for me to get to know Estonia and your point of view in terms of enlargement a bit more. I just want to take it back a bit to, and I will link it to your question, I promise. I flew in here yesterday from Warsaw where I took part in the informal General Affairs Council's meeting of the EU ministers. And the theme was on hybrid threats and the fight against FIMI, which is, of course, very pertinent in today's age and everything that we're all going through. And I think if you would notice that each and every one of the ministers, EU member states and candidate countries, but even, EU countries that aspire to be EU members, had the same case scenarios, had the same challenges. So it goes to show no borders when it comes to these challenges that we all face. And I will link it to the US because just last February, actually, Albania and the US signed an MOU when it comes to tackling disinformation, tackling FIMI and hybrid threats. So I think it's very important to realize that we heard a lot from the opening remarks as well, and there's quite a lot to unpack. But I think some very important points where in terms of we need to take action. And this goes in terms of the EU, it goes in terms of the Western Balkans, of course, but also the US. So we've seen so far, it's been, what, three weeks since President Trump has been in office. So there's quite a lot, I think, that we still need to see and to really analyze as we go forward. Yes, there's been the dismantling of USAID, but Albania and the US have had historical ties, very strong ties. And as you rightly mentioned, they've been huge supporters when it comes to the EU integration of the country, but also of the region generally. And we have a strategic partnership, a strategic dialogue, which we're looking forward to having it this year as well with the new administration. So I don't think a lot will change on that front. We see the same priorities in terms of our foreign policy when it comes to the US. It's stable. We see EU integration as an anchor for our country. And we see a lot of common ground and common work on the challenges that are mutual, such as the war on hybrid. I think every enlargement cycle has made Europe stronger. Now, this is debatable with everything that's happening today in the world, but we should really focus on this, on making us stronger. Something that I wanted to mention also on the discussions of earlier was that it's often said that we should do enlargement because of Russia, right? Because we shouldn't leave a vacuum in the Western Balkans. Well, we shouldn't progress on enlargement only because of Russia. I mean, I know this is the most appealing argument now in the days that we're living in, but we should do it for a lot of different reasons. In terms of security, yes. In terms of economic, in terms of what we can also bring to the table, apart from what the EU can also bring to the region. And I think these are important conversations that we should have.
And we will have to talk about the benefits of enlargement, of course, but also the costs of non-enlargement at one point. State Secretary Crudo, I wanted maybe to ask the question to you too. Given this Yalta-style world order that Europe is now finding itself in, Moldova, it has been alluded to, has incurred many pressures already and continues to do so ahead of the parliamentary elections scheduled later for this year. How can the EU, beef up its own support for your country when the US seems to be taking leave?
Thank you for the question. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. It's a real pleasure and honor to talk to you about EU enlargement, because EU accession is the zero priority of my country, of Republic of Moldova. And besides all the challenges and the threats that have been mentioned in the introductory speeches, Moldova remains steadfast in its commitment to pursue its European journey and to undertake all the reforms that had been started and yet to be started in order to ensure prosperity, security, and peace in our country. We all know that European accession is a merit-based approach, and we believe and we are committed to pursue this, and we are not looking for shortcuts. Therefore, Gert-Jan Koopman, Director General, mentioned a lot about the accelerated integration and the initiatives that are put on the place for the candidate countries to accelerate integration processes. And therefore, we are looking forward and we are doing our best in order to reap all the benefits from participating from those accelerated integration options, EU programs. Just to mention a few of them, last year, Moldova joined 4 such EU programs. It was JUST, the program for JUST program, the program for citizens, equality, rights and value, ESV, YASI, but also NEPT, or senior national experts program. These are just a few examples how EU is supporting Moldova in accelerating integration. Besides that, I will use this opportunity to thank for the EU member states and European Commission support towards Moldova implementing the ambitious reform agenda and the economic growth plan that was announced and approved for Moldova, which represents probably the most important financial buffer for us to continue our endeavors. 1.8 billion, that will help us a lot to make the endeavor of the country in developing and having a competitive and resilient economy to make it happen. However, we recognize that maintaining the momentum, because that's the focus of the panel, is a shared responsibility. We need not only our dedication, but also a clear and consistent message from the European Union, along with tangible support, clear milestones, and predictable path forward. For Moldova, keeping momentum is sustained political support from the EU partners, continued financial and technical assistance to drive our reforms, but also a clear and transparent accession process. We're confident that we can do that. Well, we never seen such support from EU member countries to our countries, and the enthusiasm and the commitment that the current government is having to move forward in this process is simply incredible. Not because I'm the part of the process, is because I'm witnessing how much effort is put every day. Now, regarding the question that you've mentioned, that US funding is not anymore available in our country, of course, every challenge comes also with an opportunity. Being a small country with a small administration, we are striving for limited capacity to undertake all the reforms and efforts. Therefore, we launched already a campaign of attracting all the experts that have been involved in the US-funded projects in order to cooperate with the working groups, with the central administration, in order to help us continue, push forward, and implement further the reforms and accelerate the process with alignment with the EU acquis. Is a pool of experts that is available. Some of them were calling us and say, "Hey, look, we are available to do that. I mean, for the period of time we are uncertain whether it will continue or not, or if there is something that we can contribute to, we are willing to." So that was a sign for us that we can use that talent and expertise, and we are now exploring different scenarios how we can leverage this.
Thank you very much. Ingenuitive. Secretary General Vseviov, Estonia was one of a handful of countries in December delaying the opening of accession talks in Cluster 3 on competitiveness for Serbia on value-based grounds. We've been talking about geopolitics, the need for security, the need for acceleration of the accession process. Wouldn't you say that security and geopolitics trump value-based, and therefore we should be more pragmatic with our principles?
So, Stephen, thank you for the question. And I heard the word Trump, and I automatically thought that I was going to get the Trump question. But thank you for this, and I'll get to the question in a second. But I'll start listening to my colleagues. I'll take a few steps back, and I'll start with a bit of a more philosophical approach to your question. Listening to, again, colleagues, I cannot help but think how peculiar it is that we as human beings, when we look back at our history, we tend to focus on our failures. And when we analyze our failures, we tend to analyze those in practical terms. As the West went into Afghanistan to keep Taliban from power, eventually obviously failed, Taliban is back, we're out of Afghanistan, and we analyze this as a combination of foolish policies or mistakes made. We look at what happened in Iraq. We went in, tried to democratize that country. Many consider this to have been a mistake, and we analyze this as a combination of mistaken policies or steps taken that should not have been taken, etc., etc. When we look back at our past, we tend to overlook our success stories. And even when we do recognize our success stories, we have a tendency of viewing these as developments that were always supposed to happen the way they happened. Going back deeper into our history, the post-World War II developments in Western Europe, but more relevant to this discussion, the developments in Central and Eastern Europe since the collapse of the Soviet Union, since our regaining of independence. Look at Estonia's story. All the Estonians in the audience know the story, obviously. We regained independence in 1991. The Russian troops were still here. In the winter of 91-92, we were seriously discussing whether or not to evacuate parts of Tallinn during the winter, because there was a scare that we might not be able to provide heating for the big apartment buildings. There was no economy. Arguably, when you looked at Estonia from afar, there was no reason to believe that there was political stability. We adopted our constitution in 1992. The Russian troops were still here. The Russian troops were here until 1994. Well, actually until 1995, because the nuclear reactors in Paldiski for the nuclear submarine training base were here until 1995. But the bulk of the forces left in 94. 10 years later, we joined the European Union. 10 years later, we joined the European Union, which in historical terms is a blink of an eye. Now, it would be a miraculous story of Estonia's emergence from the ashes if it didn't simultaneously happen all around Central and Eastern Europe. I'm not talking about the 1.3, 1.4 million Estonians who made the journey. I'm talking about 100 million Central and Eastern Europeans who made the journey from nowhere to what arguably is the most secure, stable, democratic, successful, the richest part of this on this planet. This success story is perhaps the greatest geopolitical success story that Western democracies have had in the past half century, since winning the Second World War against Nazism, which liberated half of Europe. The greatest success story wasn't supposed to happen. It didn't just happen. It happened because people made decisions and worked hard to make it happen, both in the sort of old Europe as well as in the candidate countries. Now, the ones who benefited are obviously us, the 100 million Central and Eastern Europeans. We benefited. You look at any metric, compare our position in Estonia here, where we are today, or where we were in 2004 when we joined, compare those numbers to where we were in 1991. There's no debate, no debate. My point here is that the rest of Europe also won. Estonia itself is a tiny part of the continent. Some could argue that we may be insignificant. But had the 100 million Central and Eastern Europeans, had all of us succumbed to instability, chaos, war, would have been a catastrophe for the Central and Eastern Europeans, but we would have dragged the rest of the continent down. No doubt about it. 100 million people, enough of a force. So I think we should look at the enlargement of the European Union indeed in geopolitical terms, but we should also ask ourselves what made it into that sort of that success story. This is where I get to your question. We talk about merit-based and the criteria that need to be met as if these were bureaucratic nuances made up by officials in Brussels. They're not. The only reason why the enlargement of the European Union has been such a success story is because it has provided for stability in terms of the candidate country's democracy and in terms of their economic prosperity. So from Estonia's perspective, there are two criteria that are of importance, and I'm simplifying things obviously, and this has nothing to do with values. This is as pragmatic as it can possibly be. We care about the trajectory of the candidate country with regard to their democracy and its stability. And we care about what bureaucrats would call alignment with CFSP. I'll put it in blunt terms. We care about whether the country is with us or against us in a conflict that we've constantly described as being existential for us. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine and the other activities related to it, the hybrid attacks, etc., on sanctions policy, on political statements, on voting patterns in the United Nations. Those are the things that we care about. And we continue to care about, not only because they're important to us, but we believe that those are important for Europe and for enlargement to be successful. Now, a few additional points. Deriving from what I've said, I think it's fairly logical to determine that for Estonia, it's clear that while we need the candidates themselves to push hard to make progress, we also need to work within the European Union and push the European Union to be ready for enlargement. Now, this could be a separate session, a day-long conference even. I'm not going to go into what has to happen within the EU. I'll just say one thing. I think in politics, in foreign policy in particular, we should apply a rule more often used in medicine. First, do no harm. First, do no harm. So what I mean by this is that when discussing what the EU needs to do to prepare itself for enlargement, we need to ensure that we do not take enlargement as such hostage to bilateral issues a member state might have with a particular candidate country. That would be doing harm. We should not do it. Secondly, we should ensure that we are not artificially linking different candidate countries. We should look at them separately based on the merits. And finally, we should make sure that once a candidate country is ready, meets all of the criteria, we don't then wake up and say that, oh, but we now need to reform the EU. If indeed we need to reform the EU, we need to get going and get that done immediately so that we would be ready when the candidates are ready. And very, very final point. The EU is, we believe, the best guarantee for a European country's political stability and economic prosperity. It's not 100%, it's not perfect, nothing's perfect, but it's the best thing that anybody has been able to come up with on this continent throughout this continent's history. However, democratic stability or political stability and economic prosperity are not possible without security. We are not living in an end of history utopia anymore. There's war in Europe, and even if hypothetically this war ends with a peace that is just and lasting, Russia will remain a major security concern. It's just one of the security concerns we're faced with. We are of the opinion that the best security guarantee on this continent is NATO membership. So as we're working to enlarge the European Union, we should not just simply overlook the question of security guarantees. Now, it might be the case for political reasons or even practical reasons that we may not be able to enlarge NATO and the EU at the same time. Estonia joined NATO a month before we joined the EU. It might not happen the same way with the candidate countries we're talking about today. Okay, fine. But then if NATO membership is not doable for who knows what reason, we should at least have as serious a discussion on the substance of the security guarantee to be enlarged to the candidate countries. We cannot afford to overlook security and focus only on political stability and economic prosperity. Just not doable. So while discussing EU enlargement, the security issue needs to be upfront and centrally in the discussion, and we cannot overlook the fact that European security architecture that has served us so well over the past few decades does stand not on one but on two pillars, both NATO and the European Union.
Thanks so much. We will return to many of these issues that have been mentioned, but this session is hybrid in two ways. We, of course, had an online intervention already, but we've also foreseen a sort of intermezzo to mark the fact that this conference is organized in a time frame whereby soon, in a few days' time, the third grim anniversary of the full-scale invasion will be commemorated. And to illustrate that, I would like to ask Ambassador Ansu, who is the director of the Ukraine-Moldova's South Caucasus division of the MFA here in Estonia, to introduce what's next. We will come back to you afterward.
Thank you, Stephen, Excellencies, dear friends. Well, the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, we all know by now it's not about territory. It's not even about lithium or any other precious minerals. It's about controlling Ukraine, its future, and it's a part of the Russian centuries-long attempt to subdue the Ukrainian language, the Ukrainian culture, the Ukrainian nation. In Estonia, we usually think that we know all about it. We have the experience of Russification from the late 19th century, from the Stalin era, from the Brezhnev years, but actually we don't know enough. It's been considerably worse in Ukraine. In the late 19th century, publications in Ukrainian were prohibited. A whole generation of Ukrainian writers was murdered in the 1930s, and the pressure to adopt the Russian language as the language of the modern educated people throughout the whole Soviet period, that pressure was so much more than we had to endure here. Writing poetry in your national language is an act of defiance, an act of resistance in many places, given the globalizing tendencies of this world. In today's Ukraine, it is all that and much more. It is real resistance in the occupied territories, where the Russians have destroyed countless books in order to destroy the Ukrainian cultural memory. And unfortunately, it's not just the books that perish. 224 literary people have been killed by the Russians. That's the latest figure 4 weeks ago. So poetry is a way of making sense of the war, of the suffering, of the pain, the hope, the whole range of emotions, and also chronicling this war. I have in my hands a whole collection of Ukrainian wartime poetry, Pomyj Siren, Between the Sirens, but of course it's only a small part of what has been written about that pain and everything else. So the poets, the Ukrainian language, they are the front line, at the front lines in the literal and in the figurative sense, and they are the front lines. To think of it, even EU enlargement, the topic of our conference today, it's not about what it is nominally meant to be, single market rules, clusters, chapters. It's about identity and belonging, ultimately about self-preservation, about creating conditions for a peaceful future where human life would be protected and where the Ukrainian language, the Ukrainian culture could flourish. So, therefore, it's only natural that we have with us today a representative of the written Ukrainian word, a Ukrainian writer, poetess, Olesya Mamchich, to give a human voice to today's Ukraine, besides the official, the political, the bureaucratic, and her poems are also included in this volume. Olesya, you have written вірш «Це пробіжка у бік мороку, у бік води мутної». A poem is a scampering towards the darkness, towards murky waters. I know you will take us today towards the darkness, but I hope eventually also towards the light. The floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for this possibility to speak personally about Ukraine and the war. As we welcomed the arrival of 2025 in the safety of Wrocław, Poland, illuminated by festive Christmas lights, my family finally managed to gather almost all together. Though my sister Sofia and I could only see our elderly parents through a video call, for a moment everyone on both sides on the screen was drawn into the illusion that this was a family celebration like just those before the war. The conversation with our parents, who joined us online from their village home in northern Ukraine, was possible thanks to a household generator capable of both storing and supplying electricity during outages in the grid. This system was a gift from Sofia and her husband, both of whom work in IT. Not every Ukrainian family can afford such a device on their own. Older people, internally displaced persons, single mothers, doctors, teachers, librarians, and other public sector workers all experience blackouts where there is no internet or heating. It is not possible to cook on electric stove or keep food refrigerated. And the only light comes from portable lanterns, candles, and even Christmas garlands. In European cities, such garlands signal the festive spirit, but in Ukraine they have been reduced to their most basic function, providing light. The moment fireworks sounded to mark the start of 2025, 2 members of my family panicked. Their bodies flinched and they instinctively sought shelter, every loud noise reminding them of the shelling. For my fluffy white Bichon Frise, who looks like a stuffed toy, there was a little to do but pick him up, wrap him in a blanket and comfort him. The other persons knew rationally that there was no danger, that the explosions were merely part of New Year display. But she too could not do nothing to stop her body from wanting to flee, to hide from an imagined threat. That person was my 19-year-old daughter Ivanka, a second-year medical student living on the 16th floor in Kyiv, close to the sky, who is woken up 2 or 3 times each night to the sounds of distant and nearby explosions. Russia has the capacity to produce thousands of drones each month, and the Ukrainian capital is struck regularly. I have an idea, said after a while Ivanka. I'll imagine that these aren't fireworks, but our air defense shooting down Russian missiles. The thought finally brought her a moment's peace. 3 years ago, I learned that Russia has launched its war against Ukraine while staying in a rented flat in Krakow with my 2 daughters, Ivanka, then 16, and her younger sister Varvara, who was 11 at the time. I had arrived there in September 2021 on a short-term Lane Kirkland scholarship from the Polish-American Freedom Foundation, and was once again living life as a student as I took a visiting year in Jagiellonian University to write a project on the local children's book market. I had just managed to take my exams, having left my older daughter under the care of friends and traveled to Kyiv to bring my younger daughter to Poland. My relatives tried to reassure me, urging me not to panic and to complete my scholarship project as planned. After all, Putin was obviously bluffing. There couldn't possibly be a war in the middle of Europe in the 21st century. Yet, despite their reassurances, the global media apocalyptic maps and predictions of the impending attack on my homeland played on repeat in my mind. I managed to take Varvara out of Kyiv just days before 24th February. By then, airlines had already been cancelling flights one after another, and the air was thick with a leaden sense of dread. On the morning of 24th February, the 3 of us sat stunned and lost in our Krakow apartment while the down Kyiv, our white dog Jerry listened to the first Russian gifts exploding, watching my parents with alarm. Jerry had never voluntarily entered the bathroom before, that place of torture by soap and shampoo. Now he headed straight there. He turned back to my parents, calling them to follow, only sitting down after they had joined him. How did he know about the 2-wall rule, a principle now familiar to every Ukrainian, and it seems even to some Ukrainian pets? That the safest place to be during an airstrike is in a room shielded by at least 2 walls. How did he know that the bathroom would be the most secure spot in the flat? From that day on, a minute or two even before the long wails of the sirens, before the air raid alert proceed to the nearest shelter, messages appeared in the apps, Jerry would repeat the same ritual. He would rush to the bathroom, growing anxious and whimpering if my parents didn't follow, his own way of calling them to safety. Sometimes he would get frustrated and bark at the siren, his head turned toward the window, a silent dialogue between a living being and the war. Since then, he reacts to any noise that sounds like an explosion, no matter how distant. Back in 2022, Ivanka and Varvara were lucky enough not to hear the whistling of Russian missiles cutting through the air. At first, they cried and begged their grandparents to take the dog and flee Kiev, where fierce battles now raged. But my parents refused outright. They said they were too old to face the horrors of evacuation, struggling on a packed platform, hoping to be one of the lucky few crammed into an overloaded train. There was no point in even trying with the dog, and they would never leave Jerry behind. The children listened and wept. 6 months later, my older daughter, Ivanka, by then 17, cried for a different reason. "Mom," she said, "all my friends are hiding in basements, sheltering from the bombs, and I'm not. I will never forgive you for taking us out of Ukraine at a time like this." No. Not like that. When Russia war against Ukraine first started 11 years ago, I was living with my daughters. Ivanka was 8 years old and Varvara was 3. We had been endured a brutal winter. The revolution of dignity has stretched across 3 endless snow-covered months, culminating in street battles in the heart of the capital and the execution of over 100 protesters. Our car had been smashed to pieces by pro-government police, and my then-husband, the girl's father, had been imprisoned for his activism. Had the Maidan uprising been defeated, he would have remained behind bars for 10 or 15 years, like many other Ukrainian citizens who took a stand. Had the Maidan uprising been defeated, Ukraine would have become a larger version of Belarus, and somewhere beyond Lviv, near our western border, Russian Oreshniks and Iskanders would already be stationed. But the pro-Russian president Yanukovych, Putin's protege and brazen criminal, fled to Rostov. That 3 months winter felt like 3 decades. For the first time, something unthinkable had happened, and my whole city of millions, a place that functioned like a well-oiled machine, hard as a rock, had been suddenly turned upside down. It was easier to believe that the sea had parted, that trees had lifted up into the sky like birds, that mountains had broken free from their foundations. Nothing was as it had been. It hadn't taken much to dismantle reality. We had barely drawn breath to grieve all that had happened in the revolution, inhaled but never exhaled. When, almost immediately, within days, Russia began its military occupation of Crimea and Donbass. I met the first refugee from Donbass, from Donetsk, while my children played outside, mimicking explosions and building toy barricades out of snow. No, not even like that. Russia's war against Ukraine began 100 years ago, long before my daughters and I had even been born. We had no idea that the possibility of our very existence was already hanging by a thread more than a century before. After years of struggling to reclaim its independence, in the early 20th century, Ukraine was overrun by an army on the march from the eastern border. Poland repelled Russia. The miracle on Vistula truly was a miracle, as did the Baltic states, but Ukraine did not. Just over a decade after Ukraine fell under Russian occupation, Stalin's repression fell across the land and the Holodomor was unleashed, a horrific genocide that has left a scar on me even generations later. Nearly every Ukrainian you can see today, myself included, is a descendant of the lucky few who survived. Millions died in agony. The children of those murdered were never born. They are not there, here. Their grandchildren never sat beside me in class, never rode next to me on the metro, never drank latte on cafe terraces. None of them will ever stand at this lectern before you, telling you about their lives. They never wrote books, never found a cure for cancer, never planted trees, never stopped the war that followed. My grandmother Maria was born in the fertile black soil of Poltava after Ukraine had already lost its battle for independence against the Russian forces. The consequences of that historic defeat were catastrophic for her family as well for all of Ukraine. First came collectivization, which in practice meant the confiscation of everything: people's home, land, livestock, forest, even coral necklaces and embroidered shirts. That is why I have no family heirlooms. Do you have a ring from your great-grandmother? A house built by your great-grandfather? A set of family china? I have nothing. Maria was the 10th child in her family. They were thrown out into the snow and their home's windows were boarded shut. For a while, they kept returning in secret, breaking the locks, preying of the wooden planks nailed across the windows. But each time, the communists would come in the night and the cycle would begin again. In place of a home, there was a snow. In place of Ukraine, there was a Soviet Union. In place of bread, there was a great famine. Not all of Maria's siblings survived in the man-made famine of 1932-33 that had been orchestrated from Moscow. The communists raided their new and much poorer communal dwelling and took every last scrap of food, even the meal just prepared for children. Maria's mother managed to tuck a small linen sack of buckwheat into her daughter's blouse. But when one of communists searched her, he found it. Furious, he grabbed the little girl and slammed her head against a ladder. Maria, my future grandmother, survived. She, alone among her 10 siblings, received an education. She was the youngest, and by the time she came of age, the Stalinist restrictions had slightly eased. Before that, those restrictions had deprived her older brothers and sisters of any such opportunity. Maria became a village teacher. Alongside her work with students, she grew vegetables and fruits throughout her life. She planted more than anyone could count, absurdly, impossibly, extravagantly much on every scarp of Poltava's soil, the world's most fertile soil she could reach. The potatoes she harvested every autumn seemed enormous to me, each the size of half of my child's head. The cellar was packed to the rafters, barely closing on account of the sheer volume of crops. And yet, when everything was gathered, when she had washed her hands and taken off her apron, she would sit down and weep bitterly. There has never been a harvest this small, she would lament. This winter we will surely starve. When the century-old Russian-Ukrainian war, sometimes subsiding, sometimes surging like a tsunami wave, finally engulfed me and my loved ones, the trauma of the Holodomor was evoking within me too. The spectre of starvation does not let go so easily, even if you belong to the third generation of memories. I began experiencing terrifying panic attacks in supermarkets, standing amid the towering displays of food, amidst those overwhelming mountains of abundance. My body remembered everything that little Maria had known about life under Russian occupation. It did not matter how much food there was. When the Russians came, we would all starve. Yet, under Russia's rule, this is not the only way death comes. It comes in many forms. Take, for example, the fate of most Ukrainian artists, politicians, scientists, and intellectuals in the first half of the 20th century. There is a reason an entire generation of Ukraine's intellectual and culture elite came to be known as the executed Renaissance. In the literary world alone, 58% of Ukrainian writers did not survive the purchase of the 1930s. 100 years later, my colleague and contemporary brilliant writer and poet Victoria Amelina wrote, "My greatest fear is coming true. I am inside a new executed Renaissance, just like in the 1930s. Ukrainian artists are being killed, their manuscripts are disappearing, and their memory is being erased. In the summer of 2023, along with 12 others, a Russian missile killed Victoria in a pizzeria in Kramatorsk. According to the unwritten, недописані project, as of January 2025, during 10 years of war against Ukraine, Russians have taken the lives of 224 people of letters, among them novelists, poets, translators, editors, publishers, librarians, and literary promoters. We walk through empty corridors of culture, of economy, of science, of architecture. These are corridors down which millions should have walked. The millions who have been erased under Soviet rule, the millions lost to the empire that today's Putinist Russia has inherited and so meticulously emulates. No, more than 300 years ago, when the Russian-Ukrainian war began. The empty corridors of the 20th century, their corners thick with dust, become tunnels that lead to the centuries before. One of these tunnels opened onto Batur in November 1708, where the people of the capital of Hetmanat has been slaughtered to the last soul. We see burned and looted houses and churches, the bodies of infants, women, men, and animals. No living person remains. We see the mark of Moscow's triumphant army. If we narrow our eyes and let ourselves forget, for a moment it feels as though this corridor and tunnels through time has led us to Bucha or Mariupol. The many layers of this war, this one war, converge at a single point today, 2025. Ukrainian historian Yaroslav Gryzak compares the current intense phase of the ongoing Russian-Ukrainian war to the First World War. Yet, in this part of Europe, it is the Second World War that has left the deepest imprint on memory, and it is on its anniversary that the phrase "never again" is repeated over and over, as if nobody has noticed that again is already here, burning in open flames, setting not just Ukraine alight, but the entire world order previously built on fragile efforts to uphold international law. Gryzak argues that structurally our war is most akin to the First World War. In this, victory does not go to the side that captures the most cities, but to the one that endures the longest. Gryzak also reminds us that today's great empires are unwieldy and fragile, that they are the first to crumble into dust. According to him, if we place the timelines of two wars atop each other, we are now somewhere around 1917, a year that brought seismic shifts across Europe as the great international powers bucked under the pressure and began to collapse. We don't know how much longer the hot phase of our war will last, but the echoes of 1917 give us much to consider. The current stage of Russia's war against Ukraine, whether we are in 2025 or as suspended 1917, is a tangible reality. It is etched on in the fate of an entire country subjected to genocide and in the shattered remains of the rule-based global order, which like billiard balls are about to set all the rest in motion. It is etched in the lives of all Ukrainians. There are none of us whose existence has not been torn asunder into the before and after. Because of the invasion, I remain in Krakow indefinitely, each week waiting up whether it's finally safe to take Varvara home. She lives a life of on standby. Like many teenagers her age, she is struggling with the sudden loss of her world. And at times she blames me for ruining her life by taking her away from the war. Meanwhile, Ivanka turned 18 and promptly announced that she is now an adult and will decide her own fate. She packed up and left for Kyiv. In our high-rise, in the neighborhood where Ivanka is living now, explosions are heard regularly. Drone debris has already fallen there. The same has happened on the grounds of the university she studied at. One evening, Ivanka called me, her voice electric with adrenaline, to tell me how a Russian Kinzhal missile had just skimmed our rooftop. She first heard a sharp whistle, then sudden silence. Somehow she knew that the abrupt quiet meant the missile had already struck a building, its walls absorbing the sound waves. She and her friend instinctively dropped to the floor, covered their heads, and braced themselves for the moment everything would collapse into the abyss. But instead the missile passed over the building, set something on fire on the roof, and kept going. For some time after, Ivanka would run down the emergency stairs from the 16th floor to the underground parking lot during every air raid alert. Eventually, the fear receded, and now, when the alarm sounded, she just tried to get back to sleep, unless it's missiles rather than drones, heading for Kyiv. In that case, she moves to the corridor considered a safer place in a building. Ivanka, like her younger sister, accused me of robbing her of 2 years of life by keeping her abroad, away from the bombs and missiles. Countless Ukrainian children feel the same. Just last week, my friend's 14-year son threw almost the same words at her. Iya Kiva, a Ukrainian poet from Donetsk, who has twice had to flee the Russian army, once recalled how in 2014 people in Donetsk initially ran on adrenaline. But after about 2 years, every civilian, not to mention the soldiers whose suffering is thousands of times worse, began to break down physically, as whatever was weakest in their bodies gave out. I now see the same process unfolding on a national scale. I'm no exception. As well as thyroids, teeth, hearts, and every other failing body part, Ukrainian families are collapsing en masse. Some, like mine, shattered at the very start of the war, when my ex-husband, a volunteer soldier from the first day, suddenly found a new love in a frontline trench and left me alone with 2 children in a foreign country in the middle of a war. Others are crumbling now. After 3 years of separation, women and children abroad, men in Ukraine. These days, when meeting old friends, one hesitates to ask about their spouses. Too often, it turns out that another personal tragedy has unfolded alongside the war. Almost every family has suffered an irreparable loss. The death of a friend, a loved one, a familiar face. It creates a constant and unrelenting background of grief. Every person you encounter, the others in line in the supermarket, the customer at the counter, the bus driver, your colleague, the hairdresser, the pharmacist, can be carrying an invisible sorrow and that can spill over at the slightest misspoken or misheard word. Beyond Ukraine, the war carries on as before. People grow weary of our war. But as Hrycak said, we are currently only at the beginning of 1917. I am certain that everything happening in Ukraine will deeply shape the future of Europe and democracy worldwide. If Ukraine were to fall, every large predator would begin devouring its smaller neighbors, and the political map of the world would collapse like dominoes. The true madmen are those who believe Putin can be pleased with a slice of occupied Ukrainian land. They are just as mad as those who thought Hitler could be placated with Austria with the Sudeten land. Predators always grow stronger and return, just as Russia returned to Chechnya a second time and razed it to the ground. They return unless they are stopped. What a rebuilt Russian army strengthened after a possible ceasefire would mean for Ukraine need no imagination. All one must do is recall our family histories. Yet, when I struggle most, I remember another story. When they came to deport my grandmother Maria, her 9 siblings, and her mother to Siberia, her father was away in Donbass, my great-grandmother Oksenia lined up her children and said, "Then shoot us, start with me. We will not go to Siberia." And they were left alone. I think she was an incredibly strong woman, someone who met an inhuman challenge in a critical moment and did not waver. Her example gives me a strength to go on day after day. A few days after Christmas and New Year's in Poland, Ivanka became anxious again. She had come from Ukraine for the holidays to see me, her younger sister, and our shaggy dog. We brought him across the border in August 2022. Now he is the only one among us with a passport bearing the stars of European Union, albeit a veterinary one. We joke that Jerry was the first in our family to join the EU, and that we and all the Ukraine will follow. I feel uneasy. My oldest daughter told me a few days after the holidays, "It's too quiet here in Poland. Something isn't right. I can't sleep in this silence. I need to hear the sounds of the Ukrainian air defense." My children's childhood and youth will never be the same again. Russia has warped their reality, their sense of what is normal. But unlike the old empire that dreams of reviving the past, we have a future, and our people are incredibly strong. Even if we are at the start of 1917, Ukrainians have learned the lessons of history. Time is on our side. And a short poem at the end. So little time in this world. Maybe I'll buy a garden bed and plant some seeds of time, some fragrant green, luscious thyme, so fresh. I'll harvest as much as I want. I'll share with whomever I want. Or I'll just sit there and watch how the time sways in the wind. Thank you, and stand with Ukraine.
Thank you, Alicia. Well, this bears for a deep reflection, obviously, and puts everything in much sharper contrast. I would like to ask each of the panelists for just some brief reactions. Maybe we can start in reverse order, if that's okay.
Difficult, obviously, to gather words after this, but we've been talking about this war in fairly similar ways since before February 24th of 2022, since we first found out that Putin indeed is going to go in. We've been describing this as a war that's outcome will shape not just Ukraine and Russia, but indeed Europe in general. We've described this war as being existential for us as Estonians and for us as Europeans. Now, I talked about how we view the past before. I also want to now add a thought to that. When you think of, or when I think of our history, I tend to celebrate the victories that we've had with concrete dates in mind. Our defeats, they tend to have vaguer anniversaries. That's because we as democracies were very good at least temporarily, explaining the defeat away. Wars, however, they always end. They end with peace. The outcome is going to be clear, even if we're going to be successful in the short term in explaining the loss away. A loss is a loss, nevertheless. So what we're focused on as Estonia, in pushing both within the EU and NATO for enlargement, in pushing for more military assistance to Ukraine, in pushing for sanctions to be prolonged and for the Russian frozen assets to be utilized, as Minister Tsahkna explained earlier. What we're really pushing for is for Ukraine to win and for the aggressor to lose. Some things are just as black and white as that. And we're proud to be on the side of light.
Thank you, State Secretary General Fisefiov.
Indeed, it's very complicated to come up with a reflection after, deep delve in the history and the implications of the war on Ukraine, but also of the neighboring region. We want to thank in the name of Moldova for Ukraine protecting Moldova and the whole Europe against Russian aggression. We were providing shelter for all the Ukrainians that came into Moldova or just transiting Moldova. We worked diligently in providing them enough opportunities to integrate into the labor market and find ways to continue their lives for their children, for thousands of women that decided to stay in Moldova, and we will do that. We'll stand with Ukraine and we'll support how we can do. Being involved in the enlargement process and being stuck sometimes in a lot of technicalities, the word used, because I'm talking about Moldova being in the full screening process, which is sometimes called a very technical process to go through, reading the whole acquis, evaluating where we stand, and trying to plan accordingly what we have to do in order to achieve full alignment to the EU. Sometimes you are lost in the final endeavor that we want to achieve. Why we want to integrate our country in the European Union. And then all of a sudden you realize that the endeavor is in fact security and peace. That's the final endeavor. We don't want to have empty corridors of culture, of economy. We don't want to have people that are afraid to talk, freely express their ideas. We don't want them to go through famine, to be insecure, not in the day after, but in the second or minute after. We want them to feel secure in their country, to have enough opportunities to grow their children in the country, in our country. And that's why we are working in Moldova diligently, tirelessly, to go through all the technicalities in order to make sure that prosperity, that security and peace will be secured. This being said, makes us even more determined to push things further. Some of the speakers in the opening remarks said that they look forward to open accession talks, negotiations for Cluster 1 with Ukraine and Moldova. We are collaborating strongly with our Ukrainian counterparts. Yesterday, by the way, it was signed a memorandum of collaboration between our country, because in this process we are coupled with Ukraine, and we decided to cooperate even more to make this process happen. Therefore, we are even more ambitious. Besides opening negotiations on Cluster 1 this spring, we will collaborate and cooperate in order to open as well the negotiations on Cluster 6 and 2 during the Polish presidency of EU Council. So we stand with Ukraine. We'll support each other in order to make sure that peace and security will be ensured in both of our country and in the whole region. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Deputy Minister Vino.
Wow, well, it's very difficult actually to find the words after what we heard, and it certainly puts things into a different perspective. It's different to hear firsthand, you know, what a normal family is going through. But I think it gives also a new meaning to the word resilience that we seldomly use. And, you know, when it comes to Ukraine and Ukrainians, we always say, oh, they're very resilient. But actually, this is the definition and an example of that. And of course, for Albanians and being part of the Western Balkans, we know all too well what a fragile region is. We know we've been through wars, we've been through, you know, difficult situations in the past. And I think even before 2022, we were with Ukraine, but especially now, and especially in light of Albania sort of punching above its weight in international arena. For instance, in 2022, actually, it coincided with Albania being as a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council for the first time in about 60 years as member of the UN. And of course, we had a list of priorities before going to the Security Council, which certainly changed since February. And we didn't have any doubt that we wanted to be at the forefront of assisting in any way we could, regardless of being a small country with limited resources, of course. But we were co-pen holders with the US on the Ukrainian file. We did the same even in 2020 as chairpersons for the OSCE. But in any way could possibly support, we have done it, and of course without even a single idea of doubt. So of course we stand with Ukraine, and I think this really gave us more of a reason to continue our support, but also to continue to have this conversation that we're having in terms of the importance of security in our European continent. And I also want to add on to what the previous speaker said as well, and what was mentioned through the story that we heard in terms of the historical context. For Albanians, being a democratic country in the last 30 years, historically, as the Secretary General also mentioned, is a very short amount of time. But we're, I think, so ambitious that we think, oh, it's been 30 years, we should be part of the EU, we should promptly, make more advances. But really, when you think about it, 30 years, it's nothing in terms of history. And to think that we've opened 2 clusters, in just the first one, fundamentals on justice reform, on October of last year, the second one on cluster 6 on external relations, and more specifically foreign policy, security and defense, just in December. And we're thinking, and our working plan with the Commission is to open all clusters within 2025, but actually within the Polish presidency, so by June, hopefully. And then close technically by 2027, and it was mentioned also in the Munich Security Conference in a panel between our Prime Minister and the Commissioner Marta Kos, that she has also the expectations that for Montenegro and Albania we can close the clusters by 26, 27. So these are certainly some ambitions that we have, and but I think it's threefold. Technical aspect political will, which was again mentioned, and I don't want to dwell too much on it, but it's very important for both sides to have the political will. And the most important one, I think, and from what we heard today, is that the battleground is also on another front. It's on the public perception. And it's on the people, because that's at the end of it, right? We talk about this, the new methodology since 2020 of the clusters, but I think at the end of the day, it's about people. It's about Albanian people, it's about Ukrainian people, it's about Moldovan people, it's about, you know, the people in our region, but also beyond, about Europeans. And fortunately, we have the highest support in the region when it comes to EU integration, but that's something that shouldn't be taken for granted, and that's what we should do, keep the momentum and use the momentum. So it doesn't come very, very often to have this kind of public support across all spectrum. So across civil society, across academia, across the different political parties in Albania. And I know that you've had here in this annual event also members of the opposition party, and I'm sure they've said the same thing, that when it comes to EU integration, we're all in this together, and it's crucial. And I think this should be an emphasis on when we talk about the EU. Something else that I wanted to mention was very briefly, of course, alignment with the EU CFSP. Albania has been aligning long before 2022, long before there was a track record of it, of the EU actually, you know, taking note of how we've aligned. We've been doing it, you know, sort of blindly. Of course, now it's quite different, because now you have to really think about implementation, and it's a lot of work that we do also with the Estonian government in discussing how best we can implement sanctions. We know how important it is, but let's work on that together. And another thing that I wanted to mention was also, you rightly mentioned, State Secretary, accelerated integration, and we always say that, we say accelerated integration, but if we heard online sometimes from our counterparts in the EU, we hear gradual integration. I just wanted to throw it out there. For us, it makes no difference as long as we're progressing. We appreciate, we love gradual integration because we're part of the table of the discussion. As I mentioned yesterday, being part of the informal GAC was very important, because we noticed, you know, that we share the same experiences and the same threats, and it's very important to share this platform and be on a level playing field, basically. So we're all for it, regardless of the term, whether it's accelerated or gradual, we support it. And I will just end with one final quote, since I gathered that this is the greatest modern writer in Estonia. Maybe I'm wrong, I don't know, maybe you'll let me know, and I hope I pronounce it correctly, Jan Kross. There's a quote that he says that history is not something that happens behind our backs. It happens in us and through us. And, well, I'll let you unpack that. I don't want to take too much time, but I think it's something pertinent to what we're doing now and the history we're trying to make.
Thank you so much. No enlargement fatigue on this panel. A redoubled sense of purpose and of unity, and I think that's very important as a benchmark for the rest of the conference. Keep that in mind. I would like to thank, on your behalf, each of the panelists, of course also Gert-Jan Koopman online for their contributions, and I look forward to continuing the conversation after a short break. Thanks so much.